Chapter 1. The Regular Life. Richard Kern's alarm went off at 6:30 a.m., sharp as always. He didn't need the alarm, he was awake before it buzzed. But he let it ring for a few seconds anyway. It was part of the routine, and Richard liked routines. They were predictable, reliable, and didn't ask for anything more than what he was willing to give. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stared at the wall opposite him. Pale gray. No pictures. No decorations. Just a wall. The apartment was like that, sterile, functional, and quiet. 400 square feet of efficiency. A bed, a couch, a small table, and a television that doubled as a second monitor for his laptop. Everything had a purpose. Nothing was sentimental. Richard dressed in the same way he always did. Dark slacks, a button-up shirt, and shoes that were polished enough to look professional but not enough to draw attention. He didn't own a single tie. He didn't need one. His job didn't require flair, and neither did his life. By 7:15 he was out the door, locking up behind him. The hallway smelled faintly of someone's burnt toast. He didn't wonder who. He never did. He nodded at the neighbor's door as he passed, though he couldn't remember if it belonged to the young couple or the older man with the dog. He didn't linger on the thought. It wasn't important. The car was waiting in its usual spot, a compact sedan that had seen better days but still ran like clockwork. Richard liked that about it. No surprises. He slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove the same route he drove every day. Past the coffee shop he never stopped at. Past the park he never walked through. Past the rows of houses where people were probably eating breakfast together, laughing, talking. He didn't envy them. Not really. That kind of life wasn't for him. It never had been. The office was quiet when Richard arrived, just the way he liked it. He was always one of the first in. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as he settled into his cubicle. A modest space with 2 monitors, a keyboard, and a stack of neatly organized files. No family photos. No vacation souvenirs. Just work. He logged in, opened his task list, and started at the top. That was the way to do it. No skipping around. No procrastination. Just one item after another until the list was clear. And when it was clear, he'd move on to overflow work. The tasks other people didn't finish. The problems that needed solving but weren't urgent enough for anyone else to bother with. Richard didn't mind. It gave him something to do. Something useful. By 8:30, the office had begun to fill. Voices drifted over the cubicle walls. Morning greetings, weekend stories, laughter. Richard tuned it out. Not rudely, just naturally. He wasn't part of that world, and he didn't need to be. He had his work, and that was enough. It wasn't that Richard disliked people. He didn't. He just didn't know how to connect. Not deeply, anyway. Growing up, he'd moved 11 times before graduating high school. 11 different schools. 11 different sets of classmates. The longest he'd stayed in one place was just under 2 years. Long enough to learn names, short enough to know they wouldn't matter. He'd learned to adapt, to blend in, to be the kind of person who fit without standing out. Chameleon. It was easier that way. Safer. Opening up meant risking something. Friendship, trust, disappointment. Richard didn't risk things. He worked. He lived. He kept things simple. At 10 o'clock, an email popped up in his inbox. Subject: Welcome our new HR director. Richard clicked it out of habit, skimmed the contents, and closed it. A smiling headshot of a woman named Vanessa, a paragraph about diversity and inclusion, and a promise of exciting changes to come. Richard shrugged. HR could do whatever HR wanted. It didn't affect him. His job was simple. Log on, work through the list, document everything carefully so the next person wouldn't have to start from scratch. That was his world. Everything else was noise. He returned to his code review, fingers moving steadily across the keyboard. The hum of conversation grew louder as more people arrived, but Richard barely noticed. He was deep in the logic, tracing a bug through a maze of functions, leaving comments like breadcrumbs for whoever came after him. It wasn't for recognition. It was for efficiency, for order. Lunch came and went without fanfare. Richard ate at his desk, a sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water. He didn't join the group that went out for tacos. He never did. It wasn't personal. It was practical. Going out meant losing time, and Richard didn't like losing time. He liked finishing things, clearing lists, making progress. By 3 o'clock, he'd completed his assigned tasks and moved on to overflow work, a database migration someone had started but abandoned halfway through. Richard picked up the thread, followed the documentation, and began stitching the pieces together. It was satisfying in its own way, quiet, methodical, predictable. At 5:15, most of the office began to empty. Chairs scraped back, voices called goodbyes, plans for happy hour floated through the air. Richard stayed. He always stayed. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The silence after everyone left was his favorite part of the day. No chatter, no interruptions, just him and the work. He kept going until 7 o'clock, then packed up, shut down, and headed home. The drive was uneventful. The apartment was waiting, as plain and orderly as he'd left it. Richard dropped his keys on the counter, loosened his collar, and turned on the TV. Not to watch, but to use as a second monitor. He opened his laptop, pulled up the migration files and kept working. Hours passed. The city outside dimmed to black, streetlights flickering on like distant stars. Richard barely noticed. He was in the zone, moving through lines of code with steady precision. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his routine, his rhythm, his life. And he was fine with that. Really, he was. When he finally shut down for the night, it was close to midnight. Richard stood, stretched and looked around the apartment. Everything in its place. Everything as it should be. He brushed his teeth, changed into a plain t-shirt and shorts and climbed into bed. Tomorrow would be the same. And the day after that. And the day after that. Richard Kern didn't need surprises. He didn't need drama. He didn't need anyone. At least, that's what he told himself. Chapter 2. The culture shift. Richard noticed the changes the way he noticed a new crack in the sidewalk. Briefly, without concern, and only because it was in his line of sight. The first email had been harmless enough. Join us for a weekly inclusion meeting. Let's build a stronger, more connected workplace. He skimmed it, clicked, mark as read, and went back to debugging a stubborn script that refused to cooperate. The second email came 2 days later. Mandatory attendance for all employees. Diversity and inclusion kickoff meeting, Friday at 3 p.m. Richard frowned at the word mandatory. He didn't mind meetings when they were about work, but this wasn't work. This was something else, something vague and social. He sighed, added the meeting to his calendar, and kept typing. Friday arrived, and Richard sat in the conference room with 20 other employees, all arranged in a semicircle like students waiting for a lecture. At the front stood Vanessa, the new HR director, radiant in a bright red blazer, her smile wide enough to power the room's fluorescent lights. "Thank you all for being here," she began, voice warm and commanding. "This is the start of something amazing. We're building a culture of inclusion, connection, and belonging." Richard kept his expression neutral, eyes fixed on the notepad in front of him. He wasn't taking notes. He was sketching a flowchart for the database migration he'd been working on. It was more interesting than buzzwords. Vanessa continued, pacing like a motivational speaker. "We want everyone to feel seen, heard, and valued. That means engaging with one another. Not just during work hours, but outside of them too. Happy hours, team building events, volunteer days. We're creating opportunities for real connection." Richard's pencil paused midline. Outside of work, he felt a flicker of irritation but smothered it quickly. No point in reacting. He wasn't here to argue. He was here because the email said mandatory. Vanessa's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Richard. Her smile didn't falter, but he felt the weight of it, like she was trying to read him, measure him, file him under needs improvement. He looked back at his notepad, unbothered. The meeting dragged on for an hour. There were icebreaker games, Richard declined politely, and group discussions about shared values. When it ended, people lingered, chatting and laughing. Richard slipped out quietly, returned to his desk, and resumed his migration work. The silence of his cubicle felt like oxygen after the stifling cheerfulness of the conference room. Over the next few weeks, the changes multiplied. Posters appeared in the break room. Connect, engage, belong. Weekly emails announced new initiatives, anonymous reporting systems, inclusion surveys, optional but strongly encouraged social events. Richard ignored most of it. Not rudely, just practically. His job was to write code, not attend mixers. But apparently someone noticed. It started with a calendar invite titled, "Quick Chat, Vanessa, HR." Richard accepted without thinking much of it. Maybe it was about benefits or paperwork. He walked into her office at the scheduled time, calm and collected. Vanessa greeted him with that same bright smile. "Richard, thanks for coming. Have a seat." He sat. Her office was the opposite of his apartment. Colorful, cluttered with motivational quotes and framed photos of team outings. A small dish of candy sat on the desk, untouched. "I wanted to talk about your engagement," she said, folding her hands. "We've noticed you haven't been participating in our inclusion activities." Richard blinked. "My work performance is fine, isn't it?" "Oh, absolutely," she said quickly. "Your work is excellent. That's not the issue. It's about culture. We want everyone to feel connected." "My job description doesn't include socializing," Richard said evenly. "I do my work. I meet deadlines. I document everything thoroughly. That's what you pay me for." Vanessa's smile tightened. "We're encouraging employees to build relationships. It's part of creating a healthy environment." Richard met her gaze, calm and unflinching. "My personal life is none of your business. Unless the company plans to pay me for my time after hours, you can't hold that against me." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Vanessa blinked, then forced another smile. "Well, we'll revisit this later." Richard stood. "Thank you." He left without looking back. He didn't feel angry. Not really. Just resolved. If they pushed beyond his official duties, he'd fight back. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew enough to recognize overreach when he saw it. Work was work. Life was life. The two didn't mix. That night, Richard stayed late as usual. The office emptied, leaving him alone with the hum of machines and the glow of his monitors. He finished the migration, documented every step, and closed his laptop at 8:30. On the drive home, he thought about Vanessa's words: connected, belonging, culture. They sounded nice. For other people. Not for him. His apartment greeted him like an old friend. Quiet, orderly, predictable. He made a simple dinner, ate in silence, and opened his laptop again. Overflow work waited, and Richard was happy to oblige. It was easier than thinking about things that didn't matter. But as he typed, a thought crept in, uninvited, persistent. What happens if they fire me? He pushed it away, focused on the code. But it lingered, like a faint echo in the back of his mind. Chapter 3. The warning signs. The first sign was subtle. A line in an email that didn't belong. Richard opened his inbox Monday morning, scanning through the usual flood of system alerts and project updates. One subject line caught his eye: Employee Engagement Summary Q1. He clicked it, expecting charts and percentages he could ignore. Instead, he found a neat little table with names and color-coded participation scores. His name was at the bottom. Red. Richard stared at it for a moment, expression blank. Non-participation. That was the label next to his name, like a scarlet letter in spreadsheet form. He scrolled down, reading the fine print. Scores reflect attendance at inclusion meetings, social events, and team-building activities. He closed the email without a flicker of emotion. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was annoyance, maybe, mild like a mosquito bite. He had work to do, and this wasn't work. By midweek, the second sign appeared. A calendar invite titled, Follow-up Discussion Vanessa, HR. Richard accepted because ignoring it would only make things worse. He walked into her office Thursday afternoon, calm as ever. Vanessa greeted him with that same polished smile, though it seemed tighter this time, stretched like a rubber band near its breaking point. Richard, she said, gesturing to the chair. Thanks for coming. He sat. What's this about? She folded her hands on the desk. We've noticed continued non-participation in our culture initiatives. Richard kept his voice even. My work performance is fine. It's excellent, she admitted. But culture matters too. We want employees who contribute to the environment. My job description doesn't mention happy hours, Richard said. Or volunteer days. Or mixers. Vanessa's smile faltered. Richard, these activities are designed to foster inclusion. And they're voluntary, he said. Right? She hesitated. Technically, yes. But then I'm choosing not to participate, Richard said calmly. That's my right. Vanessa exhaled slowly, like she was trying to keep her composure. You're making this difficult. Richard met her gaze, steady and unflinching. My personal life is not company property. The silence stretched. Finally, Vanessa said, We'll revisit this. Richard stood. Thank you. He left without looking back. That night, he stayed late as usual. The office emptied, leaving him alone with the hum of machines and the glow of his monitors. He worked through overflow tasks, documenting every step with meticulous care. It wasn't for recognition. It was for order, for clarity, for the next person who might need it. But as he typed, the thought returned, persistent, sharp-edged. They're building a case. He could see it forming like storm clouds on the horizon. Non-participation scores, follow-up meetings, words like culture fit whispered in hallways. It wasn't about performance. It was about compliance, about bending to something that had nothing to do with his job. Richard wasn't a fighter by nature. He didn't seek conflict, but he wasn't a pushover either. If they pushed beyond his official duties, he'd push back. Hard. Friday evening, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open. Not for work this time, but for research. Employment law. Discrimination policies. Rights of employees regarding off-the-clock activities. He read case studies, bookmarked articles, and made notes in a plain text file titled, Defense. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Richard believed in preparation. It was why his code was always documented, why his apartment was always orderly, why his life ran like a well-oiled machine. Chaos was the enemy, and this creeping pressure from HR was chaos in disguise. The following week, the tension thickened. Vanessa sent another email, this one with a tone that tried to sound friendly but landed like a warning shot. Richard, we'd love to see you at our next team-building event. Attendance strongly encouraged. He didn't reply. He didn't attend. He stayed late at the office instead, finishing a backlog of tasks that no one else wanted to touch. It was his quiet rebellion, doing more work than anyone while refusing to play their game. By Thursday, whispers floated through the office like static. Richard caught fragments. HR's not happy. Culture score. Termination. He didn't react. He didn't ask. He just kept working, calm and methodical, like a man building a fortress brick by brick. But inside, a vow was forming solid, immovable. If they fire me, fine. But I'll fight. I'll make it hurt. That night, Richard sat in his apartment, laptop open, legal articles glowing on the screen. He read about wrongful termination, retaliation, targeted discrimination. He learned phrases like protected activity and constructive discharge. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was thorough. If they wanted a war, he'd be ready. He closed the laptop at midnight, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the blank wall across the room. Pale gray. No pictures. No decorations. Just a wall. Richard Kern had lived his life avoiding attachments. Avoiding drama. Avoiding anything that pulled him out of his quiet orbit. But now, something was pulling, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. Chapter 4. The confrontation. Richard didn't like being summoned. The word itself, summoned, echoed in his head as he walked down the hall toward HR. It wasn't in the email, of course. The email had said, "Please stop by for a quick discussion." But Richard knew better. Quick discussions didn't happen in HR offices. They happened in hallways over coffee in passing. This was something else. Vanessa's door was open when he arrived. She was standing by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the parking lot like she was waiting for a storm to roll in. When she turned, her smile was polished, but her eyes were sharp. "Richard," she said, voice bright enough to sound rehearsed. "Come in." He stepped inside, noting the details he'd ignored last time. The motivational quote on the wall, "Be the change you want to see." The candy dish untouched, the faint scent of lavender that didn't belong in an office. Vanessa gestured to the chair opposite her desk. "Have a seat." Richard sat, posture relaxed, hands resting loosely on his knees. He didn't speak. He waited. Vanessa circled behind the desk and lowered herself into the chair with a controlled grace that felt like theater. She folded her hands, leaned forward slightly, and let the silence stretch just long enough to feel deliberate. "Richard," she began. "I'm concerned." He raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About you," she said, her tone soft but edged. "You're distant." Richard didn't flinch. "I do my job." "You do excellent work," she agreed quickly. "But work isn't everything. For me, it is." Vanessa's smile tightened. "That's the problem." Richard tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle he didn't care to solve. "Is it?" "Yes," she said, leaning in. "We're building a culture here. Community. And you're resisting." Richard let the word hang in the air for a beat before answering. "I'm not resisting. I'm working." Vanessa's fingers tapped the desk, a staccato rhythm betraying her calm facade. "Richard, this isn't optional anymore." He felt the shift in her tone. A line crossed, a mask slipping. "Are you saying social events are mandatory?" "I'm saying," she replied carefully, "that participation reflects commitment, and commitment matters." Richard's gaze didn't waver. "My commitment is in my work. If that's not enough, then we have a different problem." Vanessa exhaled slowly, like she was trying to keep her composure from cracking. "Richard, why is this so hard for you?" He considered the question, then answered with the same blunt honesty that had carried him through life. "Because my time is mine, and I don't trade it for forced smiles and small talk." Her jaw tightened. "You sound hostile." "No," Richard said evenly. "I sound clear." The silence that followed was heavy, like a weight pressing down on the room. Vanessa's eyes flickered. Frustration. Calculation. Something else Richard couldn't name. Finally, she spoke. "I'll have to document this." Richard stood, calm as ever. "Do what you need to do." He turned and walked out, leaving Vanessa staring after him, her fingers still tapping that restless rhythm against the desk. The hallway felt longer on the way back. Not because Richard was rattled, he wasn't, but because he could feel the shift, the invisible gears turning behind closed doors. This wasn't about inclusion anymore. It was about control. And Richard didn't bend for control. Back at his desk, he opened his laptop and stared at the screen without seeing it. Lines of code blurred into static as his thoughts sharpened into strategy. They were building a case. He could feel it like a storm gathering on the horizon. And if they thought he'd go quietly, they were wrong. Richard wasn't a fighter by nature. He didn't seek conflict. But he wasn't defenseless either. He believed in preparation, in documentation, in leaving no loose ends. It was why his work was flawless, why his life was orderly, why chaos never touched him until now. That night, he stayed later than usual. Not for work this time, but for research, employment law, wrongful termination, retaliation. He read case studies, bookmarked articles, and started a file titled Defense. It wasn't paranoia. It was insurance. By midnight, his apartment was silent except for the hum of his laptop. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the pale gray wall across the room. No pictures, no decorations, just a wall. He thought about Vanessa's question. "Why is this so hard for you?" And felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Not guilt, not doubt, something quieter, something that sounded almost like loneliness. He pushed it away, closed the laptop, and went to bed. Tomorrow would be another battle, and Richard Kern was ready. Chapter 5. The breaking point. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, dressed in corporate politeness but carrying the weight of a threat. Subject: Performance Alignment Discussion, Vanessa. HR. Time: 3 p.m. Location: HR office. Richard stared at the screen for a long moment, his coffee cooling beside him. Performance alignment. That was a new phrase. It sounded harmless, like adjusting gears in a machine. But Richard knew better. Words like that were camouflage, soft edges hiding sharp teeth. He clicked accept, closed the email, and returned to his work. The migration project was nearly complete, and he wanted it perfect before the storm hit. If they were going to fire him, they wouldn't do it with unfinished code hanging over his name. The hours crawled toward 3 o'clock. Richard worked steadily, methodically, like a man stacking bricks against a flood. He documented every change, every decision, every line of reasoning. Not because anyone asked him to, but because clarity was armor. If they tried to paint him as negligent, they'd fail. At 2:55, he saved his work, shut his laptop, and stood. His reflection in the dark monitor looked calm, almost detached. But inside, something coiled tight, a wire pulled to its limit. Vanessa's office was brighter than usual, sunlight spilling across the desk like an interrogation lamp. She was waiting, posture rigid, smile absent. 2 chairs faced her desk. Richard noted the second one immediately. Empty now, but meant for someone else. "Richard," she said, voice clipped. "Have a seat." He sat, his expression neutral. "What's this about?" Vanessa didn't answer right away. She tapped a folder on the desk, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "We've been reviewing your engagement metrics." Richard didn't blink. "Metrics?" "Yes," she said, opening the folder. "Attendance at inclusion meetings, participation in team-building activities, social engagement." Richard's voice was calm, almost bored. "None of which are in my job description." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Richard, culture is part of performance." "No," he said evenly. "Culture is part of preference. Performance is measurable. My work is flawless." Her eyes flashed. "You're isolating yourself." "I'm doing my job," Richard replied. "Better than most." Vanessa leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "This isn't sustainable." Richard tilted his head. "For who?" "For you," she said. "For the team. For the company." Richard let the silence stretch, then spoke with deliberate precision. "If you're planning to terminate me for not attending happy hours, say it. Don't dress it up as performance." Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. "Richard, because if that's the case," he continued, voice steady, "you'll need to explain why voluntary activities became mandatory, and why refusing to socialize qualifies as misconduct." Her fingers froze on the folder. For a moment, the mask slipped, frustration flickering across her face like a crack in glass. Then she smiled, brittle and bright. "We're not there yet," she said softly. "But we're close." Richard stood, calm as ever. "Then I'll prepare." He walked out without waiting for dismissal, leaving Vanessa staring at the door like it had betrayed her. Back at his desk, Richard opened his laptop. Not for work this time, but for war. He pulled up the file titled Defense and began adding notes. Employment law, wrongful termination, retaliation. He bookmarked statutes, copied case summaries, and drafted a timeline of events. Every email, every meeting, every phrase that smelled like coercion. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. That night, his apartment felt smaller than usual. The walls seemed closer, the silence heavier. Richard sat at the kitchen table, laptop glowing like a lone beacon in the dim room. He read until his eyes burned policies, precedents, protections. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was thorough. Thorough was his weapon. At midnight, he closed the laptop and stared at the blank wall across the room. Pale gray, no pictures, no decorations, just a wall. He thought about Vanessa's words, "We're close," and felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not anger, something colder, something that sounded like resolve. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. And Richard Kern didn't lose. The next morning, whispers floated through the office like smoke. Richard caught fragments. HR's pushing hard. Culture score. Termination. He didn't react. He didn't ask. He just kept working, calm and methodical, like a man building a fortress brick by brick. But inside, the wire tightened. By Friday, the tension was thick enough to taste. Vanessa passed his desk twice, her heels clicking like gunshots on the tile. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She just looked, quick, sharp glances that felt like scalpel cuts. Richard ignored her. He finished his tasks, cleared his backlog, and stayed late as usual. The office emptied, leaving him alone with the hum of machines and the glow of his monitors. He worked until the silence felt like armor, then packed up and drove home. On the way, he thought about the absurdity of it all, how a man who had never broken a rule, never missed a deadline, never caused a ripple was now a target. Not for failure, not for misconduct, for solitude. It was almost funny, almost. At midnight, Richard sat in his apartment, laptop open, legal articles glowing on the screen. He read until the words blurred, then closed the lid and leaned back, staring at the wall. Tomorrow would bring something. He didn't know what, but he knew this: Richard Kern was done bending. Chapter 6. The CEO visit. Richard wasn't expecting company. He never did. His apartment was a fortress of solitude. Quiet, sterile, predictable. So when the knock came at 7:45 p.m., sharp and deliberate, it startled him enough to make his fingers freeze on the keyboard. He stared at the door like it had spoken. No one knocked on Richard Kern's door. Delivery drivers didn't knock. They texted. Neighbors didn't knock. They didn't even make eye contact. And friends? Richard didn't have any. The knock came again, firmer this time. Richard stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor. He crossed the room, unlocked the deadbolt, and opened the door. The man standing there was tall, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored suit that looked like it belonged in a boardroom, not a hallway that smelled faintly of burnt toast. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried weight, the kind that made people sit up straighter without knowing why. "Richard Kern?" the man asked. Richard nodded. "Yes, I'm Daniel Price," the man said. "CEO." Richard blinked. "Of? Your company," Daniel said dryly. "May I come in?" Richard hesitated, then stepped aside. "Sure." Daniel entered, his polished shoes clicking softly against the worn floor. He glanced around the apartment, and Richard saw the moment the realization hit. The sterile walls, the bare counters, the single couch facing a small TV that doubled as a second monitor. No pictures, no decorations, no sign of a life beyond work. Daniel turned slowly, taking it all in. "You live here?" Richard's tone was flat. "Yes." Daniel studied him for a beat, then gestured toward the couch. "May I?" Richard nodded. Daniel sat, the suit creasing in ways that suggested it wasn't accustomed to furniture this modest. Richard remained standing, arms loose at his sides, waiting. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Do you know why I'm here?" Richard considered the question. "HR." Daniel's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You could say that." The conversation began like a chess match, slow, deliberate, each move calculated. "I've been reviewing some reports," Daniel said. "Engagement metrics, culture scores. Your name came up." Richard didn't flinch. "I'm aware." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "They're trying to terminate you." Richard met his eyes, calm and unblinking. "For not attending happy hours?" Daniel exhaled, a sound that carried equal parts frustration and disbelief. "For not fitting into a box they built." Richard said nothing. He didn't need to. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "You've never missed a deadline." "No. Your documentation is flawless." "Yes. You've been doing overflow work off the clock for how long?" Richard shrugged. "Years." Daniel sat back, his expression shifting. Less CEO, more human. "Richard, do you realize what that means?" Richard tilted his head. "That I'm efficient? That we've been exploiting you," Daniel said bluntly. "And you let us." Richard's voice was calm, almost detached. "I had time." Daniel stared at him, as if trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "Why?" Richard didn't answer right away. He looked at the wall instead, the pale gray expanse that had become his horizon. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost clinical. "Because it needed to be done. And I didn't have anything better to do." Daniel absorbed that, his jaw tightening. "That's not okay." Richard's tone was flat. "It's reality." Daniel shook his head slowly. "Not anymore." The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. Daniel's eyes swept the apartment again. The absence of warmth, the lack of personal touches, the way the space felt more like a storage unit than a home. When he spoke, his voice was softer. "Richard, do you ever take time for yourself?" Richard's answer was immediate. "I work." "That's not what I asked." Richard didn't respond. He didn't know how. Daniel stood, his presence filling the small room like a tide. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his tone shifting back to command. "You're not getting fired. Not on my watch." Richard raised an eyebrow. "HR disagrees." "HR works for me," Daniel said. "And they've crossed a line." Richard said nothing. He didn't need to. Daniel's voice carried the weight of finality. "I'm going to fix this," Daniel continued. "But I need you to meet me halfway." Richard's expression didn't change. "How?" Daniel smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "By letting me find a role that fits you. One that uses your strengths without forcing you into cocktail hours." Richard considered that. "And if I say no?" Daniel shrugged. "Then you keep doing what you're doing. But I think you deserve better." Richard didn't answer. "Not yet." Daniel moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the knob. "One more thing," he said, turning back. "You're not broken, Richard. You're just focused. That's not a crime." Richard's voice was quiet. "Feels like one." Daniel's gaze softened. "Not anymore." He left without waiting for a reply, the door clicking shut behind him. Richard stood in the silence, the echo of Daniel's words lingering like smoke. "You're not broken." He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know what to do with any of it. He sat on the couch, staring at the wall, and felt something shift, a hairline crack in the armor he'd worn for years. It wasn't much, but it was there. That night, Richard didn't open his laptop. He didn't read legal articles or draft timelines. He just sat, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the quiet pulse of a life that suddenly felt unfinished. Chapter 7. A twist of fate. Richard didn't expect the email to feel like a verdict. It wasn't termination, far from it, but the subject line carried weight. Subject: new role transition, effective immediately. He opened it, scanning the contents with detached curiosity. Daniel Price had kept his word. Richard was being moved into a specialized position, technical solutions architect. The description was vague but promising. High-level problem solving, minimal meetings, zero mandatory social events. It sounded almost tailored. Richard leaned back in his chair, processing the shift. He wasn't thrilled. He wasn't anxious. He was uncertain. Change wasn't his enemy, but it wasn't his friend either. Still, the alternative was HR breathing down his neck until the inevitable. This was better, cleaner. The email ended with a line that snagged his attention. You'll be collaborating with an external consultant on a strategic integration project. Kickoff meeting tomorrow at 10 a.m. Richard frowned. Collaborating. That word had teeth. He preferred solitude, the hum of machines, the quiet logic of code. Collaboration meant conversation. Conversation meant people. He closed the email and stared at the wall. Pale gray. No pictures. No distractions. Just a wall. Tomorrow would be different. He didn't know how. He didn't like that. The next morning, Richard arrived early as usual. The conference room was empty, sunlight spilling across the polished table like liquid gold. He chose a seat near the end, close enough to participate, far enough to escape if necessary. He opened his laptop, checked his notes, and waited. At 9:58, the door swung open with a burst of energy that felt like a foreign language. A woman stepped in, mid-30s, vibrant, dressed in a cobalt blazer that looked like confidence stitched into fabric. Her hair was a cascade of chestnut waves, her smile bright enough to power the projector. "Hi," she said, voice warm and unapologetically cheerful. "You must be Richard." Richard blinked. "Yes." She crossed the room with quick, purposeful strides and extended a hand. "I'm Emily Hart, consultant, integration specialist, professional chaos wrangler." Richard stared at her hand for a beat before shaking it. Firm grip, warm skin, too much enthusiasm before coffee. "Nice to meet you," he said, his tone flat but polite. Emily grinned. "Likewise, Daniel told me you're the brains behind half the company's infrastructure. I'm impressed." Richard didn't flinch. "I work." Emily laughed, a bright, unfiltered sound that bounced off the glass walls. "That's one way to put it." She dropped into the chair beside him, tossing a leather notebook onto the table like it had been waiting for its moment. "So," she said, flipping it open, "tell me everything." Richard blinked again. "Everything. About the system," she clarified, though her smile suggested she enjoyed watching him squirm. "What works, what doesn't, what keeps you up at night?" Richard considered the question, then answered with clinical precision. "The architecture is stable. The migration is complete. The bottleneck is user adoption." Emily scribbled notes, nodding like he'd just revealed the secret to eternal life. "Perfect. That's where I come in." Richard didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to do with her energy. It was like standing next to a bonfire when you'd spent years in the cold. The meeting unfolded like a study in contrasts. Richard spoke in measured tones, outlining technical constraints with surgical clarity. Emily countered with bursts of enthusiasm, sketching diagrams that looked more like abstract art than strategy. She cracked jokes. He didn't laugh. She teased him about his robotic precision. He ignored it mostly. At one point, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her notebook. "You know," she said, eyes bright, "you're a tough nut to crack." Richard looked up from his laptop. "I'm not a nut." Emily grinned. "You're definitely something." Richard returned to his screen, pretending the heat creeping up his neck was from the overhead lights. By the end of the hour, Emily had filled 3 pages with colorful sketches and bullet points. Richard had produced a detailed roadmap that could survive an apocalypse. She glanced at his screen and whistled softly. "Wow," she said. "You don't mess around." Richard closed the laptop. "No." Emily tilted her head, studying him like he was a rare species. "Do you ever have fun?" Richard's answer was immediate. "I work." Emily laughed again, shaking her head. "We're going to change that." Richard didn't reply. He didn't know how. After the meeting, Emily walked with him to the elevator, her heels clicking like punctuation marks. "Kickoff went great," she said brightly. "We make a good team." Richard didn't argue. He didn't agree either. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. Emily pressed the elevator button, then glanced at him with a mischievous smile. "By the way," she said, "Daniel told me you're allergic to happy hours." Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm not allergic. I just don't attend." Emily's grin widened. Challenge accepted. The elevator doors slid open, and Richard stepped inside, wondering, not for the first time, why life insisted on being unpredictable. That night, his apartment felt different. Not physically. Still pale gray, still sterile, but something in the air had shifted. Richard sat on the couch, laptop open, but his focus wavered. He kept thinking about Emily, her laugh, her relentless energy, the way she'd said challenge accepted like it was a promise. He didn't like promises. They were messy, unreliable, but for the first time in years, Richard felt something stir. A flicker of curiosity, sharp and unwelcome. He closed the laptop and stared at the wall. Tomorrow would be interesting, and Richard Kern didn't know if that was good or bad. Chapter 8. Sparks and static. Richard had a plan for the day. Keep the meeting short, keep the conversation technical, and keep Emily Hart's relentless cheerfulness at arm's length. It was a good plan, logical, practical, and doomed from the start. At 9:59, Emily breezed into the conference room like a gust of wind wearing heels. She carried a coffee cup the size of a small bucket and a smile that could power a small city. "Morning, partner," she chirped, dropping her bag onto the table with theatrical flair. "Ready to make magic?" Richard blinked. "We're not making magic. We're integrating systems." Emily grinned. "Same thing, just less glitter." Richard opened his laptop, pretending not to hear that. He focused on the agenda he'd prepared, a neat, bullet-pointed roadmap designed to keep chaos at bay. Emily, however, had other ideas. She slid into the chair beside him, leaning over to peek at his screen. "Wow, that's intense." "It's organized," Richard corrected. "It's terrifying," Emily countered, sipping her coffee. "Do you color code your socks too?" Richard didn't look up. "No," Emily laughed, tapping her pen against the table. "You're fun." Richard's fingers paused on the keyboard. "I'm not." "Oh, you are," Emily said, eyes sparkling. "You just don't know it yet." The meeting began and Richard launched into his presentation with surgical precision. He outlined dependencies, timelines, and risk mitigation strategies in a tone that could have been used to read a weather report. Emily listened, sort of. She nodded at the right moments, asked questions that were half serious, half provocative, and doodled little lightning bolts in the margins of her notebook. At one point, she interrupted him mid-sentence. "Quick question." Richard stopped. "Yes. Do you ever smile?" Richard blinked. "Occasionally." Emily tilted her head, studying him like a scientist observing a rare specimen. "Define occasionally." Richard considered that. "When something is funny." Emily grinned. "So, never." Richard returned to his screen, ignoring the heat creeping up his neck. By the end of the hour, they had a plan. A hybrid of Richard's rigid structure and Emily's chaotic creativity. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. Emily leaned back in her chair, stretching like a cat in sunlight. "See?" she said. "We make a great team." Richard closed his laptop. "We make a plan." Emily laughed, gathering her things. "You're adorable." Richard froze. "I'm not." Emily winked. "Keep telling yourself that." The rest of the day was a series of collisions, literal and metaphorical. Emily popped by his desk twice, each time bringing a whirlwind of energy and unsolicited commentary. First visit. "Your desk is so clean," she said, eyes wide. "Like, disturbingly clean. Do you live here?" "No," Richard replied without looking up. "Could have fooled me," Emily said, tapping the edge of his monitor. "You need a plant, or a picture, or something that says, 'Human being works here.'" Richard didn't answer. He was debugging a script and didn't have bandwidth for interior design critiques. Second visit. Emily appeared with a bag of pretzels and a grin. "Snack break." "I don't snack," Richard said. "Everyone snacks," Emily countered, tossing the bag onto his desk. "It's science." Richard stared at the bag like it was a foreign object. "I'm working." Emily leaned against the cubicle wall, munching a pretzel. "You know, if you keep this up, people are going to start rumors." Richard didn't look up. "What kind of rumors?" "That you're secretly a robot," Emily said, eyes dancing. "Or a vampire. Or both." Richard typed another line of code. "Robots don't drink blood." Emily grinned. "See? That's exactly what a robot would say." By 5 o'clock, Richard was exhausted, not from work, but from Emily's relentless orbit. She was everywhere. Bright, loud, impossible to ignore. And yet, he didn't hate it. He told himself he did, but the truth was messier. Her energy grated against his calm, but it also sparked something he couldn't name. Something that felt suspiciously like curiosity. That night, Richard sat in his apartment, laptop open, but his focus wavered. He kept thinking about Emily, her laugh, her teasing, the way she'd called him adorable like it was a fact carved in stone. He didn't like the word. It was frivolous, unnecessary, but it lingered, echoing in the quiet like a song he couldn't turn off. He closed the laptop and stared at the wall. Pale gray, no pictures, no distractions, just a wall. For the first time in years, Richard wondered what it would feel like to change that. Chapter 9. The unraveling. Richard knew something was off the moment he walked into the office. The air felt heavier, conversations hushed, like the building itself was holding its breath. He didn't need an email to confirm it, though one arrived at 8:17 a.m., subject line sharp as a blade. Subject, urgent compliance review Vanessa, HR, Time, 11 a.m. Location, HR office. Richard stared at the screen, expression unreadable. Compliance review. Another camouflage phrase. He closed the email, opened his laptop, and dove into code. If they were going to pull the trigger, he'd leave behind a system so airtight it could survive a nuclear winter. By 10:55, he was walking down the hall toward HR, his steps steady, his mind a fortress. He'd prepared for this, documented everything, archived every email, memorized every policy clause that mattered. If they wanted a fight, they'd get one. Vanessa's office door was closed when he arrived. He knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. Vanessa looked up from a stack of papers, her expression polished but brittle. "Richard," she said, voice clipped. "Have a seat." He sat, posture relaxed, eyes sharp. "What's this about?" Vanessa folded her hands, her nails tapping a restless rhythm against the desk. "We've completed an internal review. Your lack of engagement violates our cultural alignment standards." Richard's tone was flat. "Show me where that's in my contract." Vanessa's smile tightened. "Richard, this isn't about contracts. It's about values." Richard leaned back, calm as ever. "Values aren't enforceable." Vanessa's jaw clenched. "You're creating a hostile environment." Richard blinked slowly. "By working quietly? You're refusing to participate," she snapped. "That sends a message." Richard's voice was ice. "The message is that I do my job. If that's a problem, terminate me. But understand this, documenting non-participation in voluntary activities is targeted discrimination. Rights work for everyone or they're not rights." Vanessa's face flushed, her composure cracking like thin glass. "Richard." The door swung open before she could finish. Emily stepped in like a storm wearing heels. Her cobalt blazer was a battle flag, her expression sharp enough to cut steel. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, voice sweet with an edge that could slice marble. Vanessa blinked. "This is a private meeting." Emily smiled, a bright, dangerous smile. "Funny. Daniel asked me to sit in." Richard's head turned slowly. "Daniel?" Emily winked at him before dropping into the chair beside him like she owned the room. "He's very interested in how this conversation goes." Vanessa's lips thinned. "This isn't your concern." Emily leaned forward, her tone sugar-coated steel. "Actually, it is. Richard's critical to the integration project. If you're planning to sabotage that because he doesn't want to play trivia at happy hour, Daniel will want to know." Vanessa's face went pale. "I'm not." Emily held up a hand, her nails gleaming like tiny daggers. "Save it. I've seen this before. HR trying to weaponize culture because they can't touch performance. Sloppy. And illegal." Richard watched her, silent but alert. Emily's energy was electric, bright, fierce, unapologetic. She wasn't just defending him. She was dismantling Vanessa's argument piece by piece, like a surgeon with a scalpel. Vanessa sputtered, reaching for her folder. "We're fostering inclusion." Emily laughed, sharp and bright. "By excluding people who don't want to drink overpriced cocktails after work? Brilliant strategy." Richard almost smiled. Almost. The meeting ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Vanessa retreating behind a brittle promise to revisit policies. Emily striding out like a victor leaving the battlefield. Richard followed, his expression unreadable. In the hallway, Emily turned to him, eyes blazing with triumph. "You're welcome." Richard blinked. "For what?" "For saving your job," Emily said, grinning. "And for making that woman sweat. Did you see her face? Priceless." Richard's tone was dry. "You enjoy conflict." Emily shrugged. "I enjoy justice. And drama. And watching you almost smile." Richard looked away, ignoring the heat creeping up his neck. "I wasn't smiling." Emily's grin widened. "Sure you weren't." Back at his desk, Richard tried to focus on work, but his thoughts kept circling back to Emily. The way she'd walked into that meeting like a force of nature. The way her voice had cut through Vanessa's polished veneer. The way she'd winked at him like they shared a secret. He didn't like secrets. They were messy, unpredictable. But this one felt different. That afternoon, Emily popped by his desk, leaning against the cubicle wall with casual confidence. "So," she said, "how does it feel to have a knight in shining blazer?" Richard didn't look up. "Unnecessary." Emily laughed. "You're welcome anyway." Richard typed another line of code. "You didn't have to do that." Emily tilted her head, studying him. "You're right. I didn't. But I wanted to." Richard paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Why?" Emily smiled. A softer smile this time, warm and unguarded. "Because you're worth it." Richard froze, the words hitting like a glitch in his system. He looked up, meeting her gaze, and felt something shift. A spark, sharp and undeniable. Emily straightened, her grin returning like sunlight after rain. "Don't overthink it, robot. Just let it happen." She walked away, leaving Richard staring after her, his thoughts a tangled mess of logic and something that wasn't logic at all. That night, his apartment felt smaller than ever. Richard sat on the couch, laptop open, but his focus was gone. He kept replaying the day. The confrontation, Emily's defense, her smile, Her words. Because you're worth it. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know what to do with her. For the first time in years, Richard Kern felt the ground shift beneath his feet, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to stop it. Chapter 10. The turning point. Richard had successfully avoided every company event for years. It was an art form, strategic calendar blocks, polite declines, the occasional urgent project excuse. But this time, there was no escape. The email was clear. Subject: Annual Innovation Mixer mandatory attendance for project leads. Date: Friday, 6 p.m. Location: Skyline Lounge. Mandatory. That word again. Richard stared at it like it had personally insulted him. He considered arguing, drafting a response citing labor laws and voluntary participation clauses. But then he saw the kicker. Daniel Price will be attending. The CEO. The man who had saved his job and tailored his new role. Richard wasn't about to burn that bridge. So he went. The Skyline Lounge was everything Richard hated. Loud, crowded, pulsing with music that felt like static in his bones. People clustered in groups, laughing too loudly, holding drinks that looked like chemistry experiments. Richard stood near the entrance, scanning the room like a soldier assessing enemy territory. He was dressed in his usual uniform, dark slacks, button-up shirt, polished shoes. No tie, no flair. He looked like a man attending a meeting, not a mixer. Which, in his mind, was accurate. He spotted Daniel across the room, surrounded by executives, his silver hair gleaming under the soft lights. Daniel caught Richard's eye, smiled, and gave a subtle nod. A silent thank you for showing up. Richard nodded back, then retreated to the far corner, where the music was less aggressive and the crowd thinner. He was halfway through planning his exit strategy when a familiar voice cut through the noise. Well, look who decided to join the human race. Richard turned. Emily stood there, radiant in a deep green dress that looked like confidence stitched into silk. Her hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders, and her smile was pure mischief. Emily, Richard said, his tone flat but his pulse anything but. You're here. Of course I'm here, she said, stepping closer. Unlike some people, I actually like fun. Richard glanced around. This isn't fun. Emily laughed, bright and unfiltered. That's because you're standing in the corner like a vampire at a beach party. Richard blinked. That's not accurate. Emily grinned. Prove it. Come on. Before he could protest, she grabbed his hand. Warm, firm, insistent, and pulled him toward the center of the room. Richard followed because resistance felt pointless and because her touch short-circuited his logic in ways he didn't understand. They stopped near a high-top table, where Emily snagged 2 glasses of something sparkling and handed one to him. Drink, she commanded. Richard stared at the glass. What is it? Liquid courage, Emily said, sipping hers. Or sparkling water. Depends on how brave you feel. Richard hesitated, then took a cautious sip. It was water. He felt vaguely relieved. Emily leaned against the table, her eyes dancing. So, tell me, what's your grand plan for surviving tonight? Hide in the bathroom? Fake a medical emergency? Richard considered that. Both. Emily laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. Richard's tone was dry. You keep saying that. Because it's true, Emily said, her smile softening. But you're also kind of amazing. Richard froze, the words hitting like a glitch in his system. I'm not. Emily tilted her head, studying him. You are. You just don't see it. Richard looked away, ignoring the heat creeping up his neck. You're exaggerating. Emily's voice dropped, warm and steady. I'm not. Before Richard could respond, a voice boomed from the stage. A cheerful MC announcing the start of the Innovation Challenge, a team-building game involving trivia, puzzles, and Richard's personal nightmare, public participation. Emily's eyes lit up like fireworks. Oh, this is going to be fun. Richard's stomach sank. Define fun. Winning, Emily said, grabbing his arm. Come on, partner. Richard resisted. No. Emily grinned. Yes. And just like that, he was swept into a circle of strangers, handed a whiteboard, and informed that he and Emily were co-captains of Team Synergy. Richard wanted to disappear. Emily wanted to dominate. The game was chaos. Questions flying, people shouting, timers ticking. Richard stood stiffly, marker in hand, while Emily orchestrated like a general in heels. Next question, she barked. What year was the first smartphone released? Richard answered without hesitation. 1992. Emily blinked. How do you know that? I read, Richard said, writing the answer in neat block letters. Emily grinned. You're terrifying. Richard didn't reply. He was too busy calculating the probability of escape. By the third round, something shifted. Richard stopped resisting. He started answering, fast, precise, unstoppable. Emily cheered every time, her laughter ringing like music. The team rallied around him, feeding off his quiet brilliance. For the first time all night, Richard felt useful. Not just as a worker, but as a person. When the final buzzer sounded, Team Synergy had won by a landslide. Emily threw her arms around him in a spontaneous hug, warm and fierce. "You're a rock star," she shouted, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Richard froze, his brain short-circuiting. Then, slowly, he let himself breathe. Later, when the crowd thinned and the music softened, Richard found himself standing on the balcony with Emily, the city lights sprawling like constellations below. The air was cool, the noise distant, the moment suspended. Emily leaned against the railing, her smile softer now. "You were amazing tonight." Richard shook his head. "I answered questions. You showed up," Emily said. "That's bigger." Richard looked at her, really looked, and felt something crack open inside him. She was vibrant, fearless, alive in ways he'd never been. And yet, standing there with her, he didn't feel small. He felt possible. Emily met his gaze, her voice gentle. "You know, you don't have to be alone all the time." Richard swallowed hard. "I'm not good at this." Emily smiled, warm and steady. "You don't have to be. Just let it happen." Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. But when she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. That night, Richard walked home under a sky scattered with stars, Emily's words echoing in his mind like a quiet revolution. "You don't have to be alone all the time." For the first time in years, Richard Kern wondered if that was true. Chapter 11. The choice. Richard had expected fallout. He just hadn't expected silence. After the mixer, HR vanished from his radar like a storm that had burned itself out. No emails, no meetings, no passive-aggressive calendar invites. It was almost unsettling, like waiting for an aftershock that never came. Instead, something else arrived. Subject: leadership opportunity, Daniel Price. Time: 4 p.m. Location: executive conference room. Richard stared at the email, his pulse ticking faster than he liked. Leadership. That word didn't belong to him. He was a builder, not a talker. A solver, not a leader. He considered ignoring it, but Daniel wasn't the kind of man you ignored. The executive conference room was all glass and steel, a cathedral of power perched above the city. Daniel stood at the head of the table, silver hair gleaming, presence filling the space like gravity. "Richard," he said, smiling warmly. "Thanks for coming." Richard nodded, taking the seat nearest the door, always nearest the exit. "What's this about?" Daniel folded his hands, his tone calm but deliberate. "You've been doing extraordinary work, quietly, consistently, without asking for recognition. That matters." Richard's voice was flat. "I wasn't looking for recognition." "I know," Daniel said. "That's why you deserve it." Richard blinked. "Deserve what?" Daniel leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "A promotion. Technical solutions lead. More autonomy. Bigger projects. A team." Richard's stomach tightened. "A team." Daniel smiled faintly. "Not a circus. Just a small group. People who need your clarity. Your precision." Richard shook his head slowly. "I'm not that person." Daniel's voice softened. "You are. You just don't see it." Richard looked away, his thoughts a tangled mess of logic and fear. Leadership meant visibility. Meetings. Decisions that weren't just technical. It meant stepping out of the shadows he'd lived in for years. "I need time," he said finally. Daniel nodded. "Take it. But don't take too long. You're ready, Richard. Whether you believe it or not." Richard walked out into the late afternoon light, the city sprawling below like a map of possibilities he didn't want to read. He wasn't ready. He wasn't built for this. He was built for code, for quiet, for control. And yet, Daniel's words lingered like an echo he couldn't silence. "You're ready, whether you believe it or not." He was halfway to his car when a voice called out behind him. "Hey, promotion boy." Richard turned. Emily was striding across the parking lot, her green dress replaced by jeans and a leather jacket, her smile bright enough to cut through his storm. "How do you know about that?" Richard asked, his tone sharper than intended. Emily grinned. "Daniel told me. He's excited." "I'm excited." "You look like you swallowed a lemon." Richard exhaled slowly. "I'm not sure." Emily tilted her head, studying him like a puzzle she intended to solve. "What's not sure?" "You're brilliant. You'd crush it." Richard's voice was quiet. "It's not about the work." Emily stepped closer, her eyes warm and steady. "Then what?" Richard hesitated, the words heavy in his throat. "Visibility. Tension. People." Emily smiled softly. "Ah, the human factor." Richard didn't respond. He didn't need to. Emily touched his arm lightly, her fingers warm against his sleeve. "You don't have to change who you are to lead. You just have to let people see what you already do." Richard swallowed hard. "That's not easy." Emily's grin returned, bright and fierce. "Nothing worth doing is easy." Richard looked at her, really looked, and felt something shift, sharp and undeniable. She wasn't just talking about the job. She was talking about him, about life, about everything he'd kept locked behind walls for years. Emily squeezed his arm gently. "Say yes, Richard. Not for them. For you." That night, Richard sat in his apartment, staring at the pale gray wall that had been his horizon for so long. His laptop was closed. His phone was silent. The world felt suspended, waiting for his answer. He thought about Daniel's offer, about Emily's words, about the mixer, the balcony, the spark he couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, Richard Kern didn't want the same routine. He wanted more. He picked up his phone and typed a message. To Daniel Price, subject, leadership opportunity, body. I'll take it. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. The reply came minutes later. Congratulations. Let's talk Monday. Richard set the phone down, his pulse steady but his chest strangely light. He'd done it. He'd said yes. And for the first time in his life, Richard Kern felt like the world was opening instead of closing. Chapter 12. The Leap. Richard had faced system crashes, catastrophic bugs, and migration deadlines that could make grown engineers cry. None of that compared to the terror of standing outside a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, waiting for Emily Hart. He checked his watch. 9:58. 2 minutes early. He always arrived early. It was efficient, predictable, safe. But nothing about this felt safe. The glass door swung open, and there she was. Jeans, boots, a soft gray sweater that looked like comfort personified. Her hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders, and her smile, well, her smile was the kind of thing that rewrote code in his brain. Richard, she said, bright and warm. Like they were old friends instead of two people orbiting something new and terrifying. You made it. I said I would, Richard replied. His tone flat but his pulse anything but. Emily grinned. Come on. I got us a table. The coffee shop was cozy, all warm wood and soft light, the air rich with the scent of roasted beans and cinnamon. Emily led him to a corner table, sliding into the seat with effortless grace. Richard sat opposite her, his posture straight, his hands folded like he was about to negotiate a contract. Emily tilted her head, studying him with amused affection. You look like you're bracing for impact. Richard blinked. I'm not. You are, Emily said, laughing softly. Relax. It's coffee, not a root canal. Richard glanced at the menu, scanning options like they were error logs. What do you recommend? Emily smiled. Something that isn't black coffee. Richard looked up. Why? Because you deserve joy, Emily said, eyes sparkling. Try a caramel latte. Live dangerously. Richard hesitated, then nodded. Fine. Emily grinned. Progress. They ordered. Emily's drink came with whipped cream and sprinkles. Richard's with caramel he pretended not to notice. When the cups arrived, Emily raised hers in a mock toast. To new beginnings, she said. Richard stared at her for a beat, then lifted his cup. To coffee. Emily laughed, bright and unfiltered. Close enough. The conversation started simple: work, projects, the absurdity of corporate buzzwords. Emily teased him about his robotic precision. Richard countered with dry observations that made her laugh harder than he expected. Slowly, the tension eased. Richard found himself listening. Not just hearing, but really listening. To her stories, her laughter, the way her hands moved when she talked. At one point, Emily leaned forward, her voice softening. You know, I didn't think you'd say yes. Richard blinked. To coffee? To this? Emily said, gesturing between them. You're not exactly Mr. Spontaneous. Richard considered that. I'm trying. Emily smiled, warm and steady. I can tell. Richard looked down at his cup, the caramel swirl catching the light. It's not easy. Emily reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. Light, deliberate, electric. Nothing worth doing is. Richard froze, his breath hitching. Then, slowly, he let his hand stay. They walked out an hour later, the city bright and alive around them. Emily slipped her arm through his like it was the most natural thing in the world. Richard didn't pull away. He didn't want to. Next time, Emily said, her tone teasing. We're doing brunch. Richard blinked. Brunch. Pancakes. Mimosas. Social chaos, Emily said, grinning. You'll love it. Richard's voice was dry, doubtful. Emily laughed, squeezing his arm. Challenge accepted. That night, Richard sat in his apartment, staring at the pale gray wall that had been his horizon for so long. It didn't feel the same. Felt smaller, like the world outside was calling, and for once he wanted to answer. He opened his laptop, not for work, but for something else. He typed a message. To Emily Hart. Subject. Next time. Body. Brunch sounds acceptable. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. Emily's reply came minutes later. Progress. See you Saturday, robot. Richard smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. Chapter 13. A new chapter. Richard Kern woke up on a Saturday morning to sunlight spilling across his apartment floor like liquid gold. For years, mornings had been predictable: coffee, silence, work. Today was different. Today he had brunch plans. He stared at the pale gray W. All that had been his horizon for so long. It didn't feel like a wall anymore. It felt like a backdrop. Something behind him, not something holding him in place. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Emily. Emily, robot, don't be late. Pancakes wait for no one. Richard smiled. A real smile, unguarded and warm. He typed back, Richard, on my way. The brunch was chaos in the best possible way. Sunlight streaming through wide windows, tables crowded with laughter, plates stacked with pancakes and fruit. Emily was already there, waving like a beacon in a sea of chatter. She wore a soft blue sweater and a grin that could power a small city. "You made it," she said as he slid into the seat across from her. "And you look almost relaxed." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Almost." Emily laughed, pouring syrup over her pancakes. "Progress." Richard ordered coffee black because some habits die hard and pancakes because Emily insisted. They ate, they talked, they laughed. Emily teased him about his robotic precision. Richard countered with dry humor that made her laugh harder than he expected. Slowly, the noise around them faded, replaced by something quieter, something that felt like belonging. At one point, Emily leaned forward, her eyes soft and steady. "You know," she said, "I'm proud of you." Richard blinked. "For eating pancakes?" "For saying yes," Emily said. "To this. To change." Richard looked down at his plate, then back at her. "It's easier with you." Emily smiled, warm and bright. "Good. Because I'm not going anywhere." Richard didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was written in the way he looked at her, in the way his hand found hers across the table, in the way the world felt bigger and brighter than it ever had before. Weeks passed. Richard stepped into his new role, technical solutions lead, and discovered that leadership wasn't about noise or spotlight. It was about clarity, about building bridges instead of walls, about trusting people even when it felt like stepping off a ledge. He wasn't perfect. He stumbled. He second-guessed. But Emily was there, cheering him on, teasing him when he retreated, pulling him back into the light with laughter and warmth. She became his anchor and his spark, the chaos he didn't know he needed. His apartment changed too. Slowly, quietly, like a system updating in the background. A plant appeared on the windowsill Emily's doing. A framed photo landed on the shelf. The two of them at the mixer, Emily grinning, Richard looking almost human. The pale gray wall stayed, but now it had company. A splash of color, a sign that life had moved in. One evening, Richard sat on the couch, Emily curled against his side, her laughter soft against his shoulder. The TV played something forgettable, but Richard wasn't watching. He was thinking about the man he'd been, about the walls he'd built, about the leap he'd taken. Emily looked up, her eyes bright. "What?" Richard shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just wondering how I got here." Emily grinned. "You said yes." Richard considered that, then nodded. "Yeah, I did." Emily kissed his cheek, her voice a whisper. "Best yes you ever gave." Richard smiled, really smiled, and felt the truth settle deep in his bones. He wasn't a robot anymore. He wasn't a ghost in his own life. He was Richard Kern, still quiet, still precise, still himself. But now he was something more. He was loved. He was living. He was extraordinary.